Good afternoon. Welcome to Smithsonian Gardens Let's Talk Gardens, a weekly webinar series on gardening and related topics. Today, we have a very special presentation. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Cindy Brown. I'm the Education, Collections, and Access Manager at Smithsonian Gardens. We have so many great things that are happening on our website. We invite you to go on and look and learn more about Smithsonian Gardens after this presentation. A bit of housekeeping first. Please notice that we have the chat box running, and we'd like to have you post your questions in the chat box during the presentation. Also, if you're having some difficulties with the view, look at the top corner of your screen. You're able to change the view from gallery view to speaker view. So you can see Sarah speaking, who is going to be our presenter today, or you can see both of us in it. Actually, I'm going to mute myself so you won't be able to see me. And then if you're having problems with getting good reception, please remember to close all the tabs on your computer and just have this one open for optimal viewing conditions. So we won't be answering the questions during the presentation. We'll be addressing the questions after the presentation. So please don't be surprised if we don't call on you or answer your questions at the time during the presentation. So let's just jump right in. Today's presentation is Monarch Waystations for any size garden. Our presenter is Sarah Dickert. Sarah is one of our horticulturists at Smithsonian Gardens. So Sarah, will you please enlighten us on what is a Monarch Waystation and how we put one together? I'll see you after the presentation.
All right, we'll see you, Cindy. All right, I'm so glad to have all of you joining us today. Hopefully you're excited to learn about monarchs. I'm excited to tell you about it. So just wanted to start with a little snapshot of what I'll be covering during this presentation so you know where I'm going to be headed. I'm going to start with talking about one of the exhibits that we have here at Smithsonian Gardens called Monarchs on the Move, which is basically the impetus for this presentation. So I wanted to talk about the exhibit and kind of why it brought us to this point today. Then I'm going to cover what is a monarch, a little bit about its biology, its migration patterns, and I think probably the important slide that's going to be during this is why is it important to save monarchs? Why should we care about it? And then, of course, what is a monarch waystation? Since some of you might already be asking yourself that question. And then finally, wrapping up with some plants and examples of how you can create a monarch waystation at home. So as I mentioned, this presentation is sort of an expansion or an in-depth look at one of our exhibits that we have called Monarchs on the Move. And this exhibit is part of our larger Smithsonian Gardens campus-wide habitat exhibition. The whole exhibition looks at the concept of protecting habitats protects life. And so this particular exhibit, which is located at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden, is specifically talking about monarchs. So just to give you a point of reference, for those of you that may not be overly familiar, we are located in Washington, D.C., and we have gardens around all of the Smithsonian museums here on the National Mall. So kind of keep that in mind as I'm talking about this presentation. It is from the perspective of a Mid-Atlantic or an East Coast garden. So for those of you that might be watching from other parts of the country, just know that there may be some differences in the plants that and things that you'll be seeing in the area where you live compared to what we have here, but the concepts will be the same. The other reason I kind of wanted to talk about this exhibit is to really point out the fact that this is an exhibit that we incorporated into existing garden beds. This is not a garden that we created from scratch. There were 4 beds that run along a very busy sidewalk right outside the Hirshhorn. And it was really just a matter of incorporating some additional plant material into a garden that was already there. And we were able to create a monarch waystation that way. And I say this because some of you may already have established gardens. And so I don't want you to feel like, oh, I have to go rip out a beautiful garden that I've already spent years tending and putting in and installing. don't worry about that. You don't need to do that. This is something that you can do with an existing garden. And certainly if you don't have a large garden space, you can always do it in containers or something like that. So I wanted to start a little bit by talking about sort of what monarchs are and a little bit about their life cycle, specifically because that ties into the components of a monarch waystation and why we have certain criteria for a monarch waystation, because it applies to the various life cycles. So monarch starts off as a little egg, much like a lot of other insects or many other insects. From there it hatches and it starts its larval or its caterpillar stage. In the botanical world, we call it larva. Most people just call them caterpillars. And it actually goes through 5 different stages of being a caterpillar as it gets successively bigger. From there, it then forms its chrysalis, which many people are familiar with all kinds of butterflies, and then emerges as the beautiful black and orange butterfly that we love seeing in our gardens. So I also wanted to talk about the migration. Again, this is part of why having these waystations ends up being such an important thing and why we're talking about this today. Monarchs are a little bit unique. Most insects, especially native ones in whatever area you're living, will live their whole life and complete all of their life cycles more or less in that area. They might sort of overwinter in foliage or sticks and debris and things like that that are in their garden. But monarchs are different in that they actually migrate, much like, you know, different birds that we have that you may be familiar with that migrate, so do monarchs. So you can see on the map that the little red star is more or less where Washington, D.C. is. So the monarchs that we see in our gardens around the National Mall in D.C. are traveling all the way down to Mexico to the little blue star that you can see. So that's a pretty far distance, especially for an insect that weighs about as much as a paperclip. So that's a pretty long journey. And so you can imagine that they need some help in their journey getting both to and from Mexico. So the migration pattern that I have listed here is a fairly simplified version for everyone. Certainly you can get a much more complex explanation online and through some of the sources that we'll be providing both in the chat box and on our website at the end of this presentation. But I just wanted to give an overview so you sort of understand how their migration works. So I started off with, in the summer, we see monarchs flying around in our garden. Usually there's 2 or 3 adult generations that we actually have over the course of the summer. And those adults will live for about 2 to 5 weeks. Then in the fall, as basically the monarch butterflies are getting cues that the seasons are changing, excuse me, and that it's time to, knowing that winter is coming, and it's time to start migrating. So that very last adult butterfly that hatches or transforms in the fall is what makes the journey all the way down to Mexico. And that same adult butterfly that we see possibly here in the fall is what lives for about 8 or 9 months, travels and then lives in Mexico for about 8 or 9 months on Oyamel fir trees down in Mexico. And they live down there until the spring, at which point they start breeding and mating again. And then their successive generations are the ones that start moving back north again for the summer months. So usually by the time that we see them again in the summer, that's maybe 3rd or 4th generation from the last adult that we saw in our gardens the previous fall. So now this is just about a minute-long video. There's no sound, just from one of the monarch reserves that's down in Mexico. It's really pretty awe-inspiring. This is just a very short clip. If you go onto YouTube or just Google videos of monarch migration or monarchs in Mexico, you will see some pretty awesome videos, but I think it's a pretty cool site, so I couldn't resist not including a video of this, so we'll let that play. And again, there's no sound. Okay. So you can actually see kind of that last little freeze frame is that there's literally so many monarchs that collect on the fir trees down in Mexico that it just like weighs down the branches. And it's just, I don't know, it's kind of crazy. And it's sort of one of those amazing feats of nature to see. And I think that kind of beautifully leads into why should we care about saving monarchs. Certainly seeing videos like that is just kind of awe-inspiring. And I think that even just that is a good reason to save them, because you want to keep seeing cool things like that every year. But some of the other reasons, one of them, kind of a big one, is that they are a pollinator. So I think probably many of you are familiar that pollinators are definitely at risk right now, that their populations are declining, and that is the same with monarchs. Their populations have been definitely declining pretty dramatically in the past several years, maybe the past couple decades. And the reason we want to save pollinators is that they're so critical to keeping our environment going. Some of you may have heard the statistic that about a third of the food that we eat is a result of pollinators. Chocolate, for example, I'm sure there's at least a few of you out there that would be pretty upset if chocolate wasn't able to be made anymore. But if we lost our pollinators, we would lose things such as chocolate. And so certainly, though monarchs are not the pollinator for chocolate, they are responsible for a lot of the pollination that we have going on in our native habitats. And they share the same habitats with a lot of our other native pollinators, which sort of leads into the second point of that they're an environmental indicator for us. So since most insects don't sort of have these mass migrations, it's a lot easier to use monarchs as sort of an indicator species, so to speak, for the health of pollinators and the health of our habitats. Because they migrate, because we sort of get them all en masse every year, scientists are able to keep track of their population numbers and really assess how the population of monarchs is doing. And so as they're seeing numbers go down and their populations decline, it's pretty easy to make the assumption that if their numbers are declining because they're losing habitats, or their habitats are being broken up by development, or because of changes in the climate, that our other native pollinators are also suffering, and that their population numbers are also going to be decreasing for the same reasons. And if those two things aren't enough to convince you, just consider how much joy it brings you to see monarchs in the garden. It's always really exciting. I mean, even in our gardens, when we have visitors and kids coming through, you know, it stops everyone in their tracks when they see a monarch butterfly flying around the gardens. So at the very least, consider trying to do what you can to help save them for the sheer fact of the beauty that they bring to your garden space. So now, what is a monarch waystation? So to kind of sum it up into one word, a monarch waystation is essentially a pit stop. So I didn't feel like I could sort of rewrite or explain what a Monarch Waystation is better than the definition that's on the Monarch Watch website, the Monarch Watch organization. They're sort of the ones sort of leading the charge on helping individuals and groups and organizations create these sort of monarch pit stops in their homes or their businesses, schools, that kind of thing. And so they define a monarch waystation as places that provide resources necessary for monarchs to produce successive generations and sustain their migration. So, I mean, you saw they have a pretty long journey, both in the fall and in the spring. And I know I can't take a road trip for more than a couple hours without making a pit stop or two myself. So you can imagine that they probably have similar needs. So now I want to get a little bit into the components, kind of what makes up a monarch waystation. So starting with the size can really be anything. And I think that's one of my best takeaways from this is don't feel limited by the outdoor space that you have, that you can really make a difference no matter what you have available to you. It can be a pot on a patio, or it can, you know, on a balcony, or if you have just acres of land, then, you know, go crazy. Ideally, it should be in about full sun, which we define as being 6 or more hours of sun a day. If you have something that's more shady, it's not impossible, but it might be a little bit more difficult, especially because a lot of the plants that we're going to be using for monarch waystations are ones that prefer full sun. But it is possible, and again, don't feel limited if you have a little bit of a shadier garden. Keep in mind that as you're planting and putting in plants in your garden, that you want them to be basically spaced appropriately. You want them to be close together, but not crowded. Having plants that are close together helps to provide a sense of shelter for monarchs as they're laying their eggs, and knowing and feeling comfortable that their offspring are going to have a safe place to eat until they turn into a butterfly, and also for the butterflies as they're flying around, that they can feel protected by other plant material that's there. For food, you want to have a variety of food sources. As I mentioned with our Monarchs on the Move exhibit, we had both natives, non-natives, annuals, and perennials in that garden. So we had a really wide selection of plants for monarchs to choose from. And then, as with any garden, you want to keep in mind that you'll have to do a little bit of maintenance. I know the maybe less fun part about gardening. And that's going to be regular watering, weeding, perhaps a little bit of just light mulch just to kind of help keep the soil moist. Because as you keep plants healthy, it's going to be easier for the monarchs to access them and use them if the plants themselves are healthy. One big thing to keep in mind is that you should avoid using pesticides. Those pesticides could potentially harm the monarchs themselves, or even if it doesn't harm the monarchs, it could harm other pollinators, and we want to try to avoid that if we can. And the last component that's kind of the biggie in this conversation is Asclepias. So Asclepias, the common name for that is milkweed. There is Asclepias native to all parts of the United States. So I'll be talking about ones, again, that we're familiar with in our gardens here in the Mid-Atlantic and sort of East Coast, generally speaking. But there are lots of resources online that talk about what Asclepias is native to your area. So you can definitely look up the best ones to get. So milkweed is the only plant, the only one that monarchs can lay their eggs on and raise their young on, that the caterpillars can eat as they are growing and maturing. And I actually just heard a webinar just about a week or so ago that listed a stat that we need about 1.8 billion additional stems of milkweed to help build and then sustain a healthy population of monarchs. And that's addition to the milkweed that is already out in our habitats and in our gardens. So we've got a long way to go. Hopefully every one of you is going to get out there and buy some milkweed after this presentation so we can make a very small dent in that 1.8 billion stems. But why is milkweed so important? Why is that such a critical plant for the monarch caterpillars to eat and for them to use? The main reason is it's because it's really their only defense mechanism. So as you can see in this picture, that Asclepias leaf, that milkweed leaf, is oozing kind of like a white sap. And that's kind of like a latex type sap. And it contains a chemical called cardiac glycosides. And as the caterpillars are eating the milkweed, as they go through their larval stages, they're sequestering those chemicals inside their bodies. And then those same chemicals stay inside their bodies once they change into being a butterfly. Now, as you can probably imagine, something that has the name cardiac in it, probably not going to be really good, and it isn't. So as things like birds or other critters decide that they want to try to sample either a monarch caterpillar or a monarch butterfly, they're going to get sick. Maybe if they eat a lot, they could end not well for them. I know even for us as humans, if you're gardening with milkweed and if your leaves that break off and some sap gets on your skin, sometimes that actually can be a little bit of an irritant. So maybe just a little plug here to make sure that you wear gloves or even long sleeves if you have very sensitive skin. I've also seen some pretty gross pictures of people that have gotten milkweed sap in their eyes. So I also say don't get it in your eyes. But you can imagine if it's caustic for our skin and for our bodies, what that's going to do to a bird or a predator. And so that's why the monarchs are using this plant to help keep them protected. Because if a bird or something like that eats a butterfly, gets sick, it's going to say, hey, I am not going to eat that again. That did not end well for me. And so from that's also why they have sort of their iconic black and orange coloration. It's a warning sign. It's saying, hey, don't eat me. I'm not going to taste good. I'm going to make you sick. And that's one of the reasons that monarchs have that coloration, is to kind of warn would-be predators that they're not worth eating and they should not do that. So now I want to take a little bit of a deep dive into different types of Asclepias because it's one of the most important, or it really is the most important feature and component of a waystation. When you can have lots of different nectar plants, you can really only have one plant as what we call a host plant that the monarchs use to lay their eggs and raise their caterpillars. So this first one is Asclepias tuberosa, which is called butterfly weed. This one, especially in gardens in our area, it's pretty common. It's really nice for smaller gardens and also for containers because it only gets about 1 to 2 feet tall. It has beautiful orange foliage, orange flowers. And there are also a couple varieties now that come in yellow flowers and some even with like red and orange together. So it's a really beautiful plant, and it really is, this one in particular is native really all up and down the East Coast. The next one is Asclepias syriaca, which is common milkweed. So this one, actually some of you, especially here in the mid-Atlantic or kind of on the East Coast, might recognize this as sort of a roadside weed. So it is not a weed, we want it to be there. And this is a good choice for gardens, but I will give one little warning that it does spread by underground rhizomes. So it will definitely, we're going to say, colonize your garden, but it is easy to sort of keep it contained by just pulling out or removing stems that may be traveling a little farther than you want, to kind of keep it contained to a certain space. It does get a little bit taller, usually about 3 to 4 feet tall, but it does have sort of like those beautiful pink flower clusters. And this is one where I think we really see a lot of caterpillars on, especially like later in the season in our gardens around the mall. The next one I wanted to highlight was Asclepias incarnata, which is swamp milkweed. So as the name suggests, this is one that actually is tolerant or enjoys a little bit wetter soil. So if you have maybe a rain garden or something like that, this could be a really good choice to add to an area where you have moisture soils, where other plants might suffer from root rot, that kind of thing. This is another one that gets a little bit taller, 3 to 4 feet tall. However, it does not spread by rhizomes. It's more of a clump spreader. So though it's tall, and you can see in this picture that it definitely needs a lot of elbow room in your garden, it has a little bit of a neater, tidier growth habit to it. So this next one, Asclepias verticillata, which is world milkweed, is a really beautiful, delicate milkweed. It has really fine textured foliage. And what's nice about it is that it does tolerate light shade and it stays a little bit on the shorter side. So if you have a shadier garden or you're not convinced that you really have full sun, this could be a good option. I will say that this one might be a little bit harder to find in something like a garden center. Many of the other ones that I just talked about, the first three, thankfully, due to the rise in interest for home gardeners to plant natives or to plant things that are beneficial for monarchs, you're starting to see a lot more of those milkweeds in garden centers and much more readily available. This one might be a little bit harder to find, so you might have to do a little bit of internet research and try to find like a mail order vendor to get this one. This is another one that is native to the Southeast. Now, admittedly, I am not familiar with it, but I just wanted to put it out there for those of you that are kind of living maybe south of Virginia from where we are, that this might be a good option for you and might be available in some of your garden centers. This is Asclepias variegata, which is the white milkweed. And from what I understand, it also tolerates a little bit of light shade. So at least want to put it out there. I confess I don't know a lot about this one in particular. It's not one that we grow in our gardens, but I just wanted to share the information with all of you. So now that we talked about some of our really nice, beneficial milkweeds and how awesome they are, I do unfortunately have to now have a word of warning about another milkweed. And this one is Asclepias curasabica, which is tropical milkweed. So this one is really gaining in popularity, especially in garden centers. You actually see it just as much or maybe even more than some of the other ones, particularly because it has the beautiful flowers on it. There's one now that has this like really gorgeous, excuse me, variegated foliage. And it's easy for growers to produce and send to garden centers. Sort of where it gets to be a problem is that it's not native to North America. It's native to Central and South America and to Mexico, which gives us a few problems when it comes to having this one in our gardens here in North America. So just like a little, going a little bit into the dangers of this tropical milkweed. One of the big ones is that it disrupts migration patterns. So in the fall, many of our native milkweeds, because it's fall, it's starting to shut down and go dormant for the winter months. And that's part of what is a cue to monarchs that, okay, it's fall, I can't keep breeding, I can't keep laying eggs, it's now time for me to start moving south for the winter months. This tropical milkweed, especially if you live in an area where maybe you have milder winters, could essentially be evergreen. And so it tricks monarchs into thinking, it's not winter, winter's not coming, this milkweed's still available, I can keep laying eggs. And if you have monarchs laying eggs on this plant too far into the fall, then the successive adults that are born, it will be too cold, it will be too late for them to make the journey south to Mexico. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So that's one of the issues. Another one is that it can infect the monarchs with a parasite, which I'm going to be honest, I'm not going to try to pronounce, but it is known as OE. And this monarch that's in the picture on the slide has been infected with this parasite. So you can see its wings are really crumpled and misshapen, and it's likely that it will not be able to flatten out its wings and straighten them out, and it won't be able to fly, and you see where I'm going with this. So this is a parasite that is carried on monarchs and is then basically it'll live on the milkweed plants, and it will live on other milkweed plants, not just this tropical one. The big difference is that for our native milkweeds, when the plants die back over the winter and you kind of remove those leaves and that foliage isn't there, the parasite dies with it and is removed with it. So then in the spring, as the new fresh foliage comes up and you have the new generations of monarchs coming back to our gardens for the next year, that's got nice, fresh, clean, uninfected foliage for the caterpillars to eat and to enjoy and to live. Because the tropical milkweed could be either evergreen, especially if you're in southern areas like Southern California or in Florida, the parasite is just going to keep building up. The numbers are going to keep building up. And every time a monarch visits that plant and lays eggs there and the caterpillars eat it, it's just going to keep getting infected with that parasite. So basically there's no opportunity for the parasite to sort of leave your garden. I will say, though, I would recommend just not using it at all and trying to avoid it. If it's something you want to use because it's beautiful, or maybe it's the only one you can find at a garden center, something like that, I would say monarchs can use it. They can technically eat it and raise their young, but take some precautions. So one of them being in the fall, which probably September, October, cut the whole plant back to the ground. I know that may be hard to do. I know I have a hard time cutting back a plant that looks perfectly good and healthy, but it's really the best way to at least give monarchs the indicator that it's time to move south, that it's time for them to start migrating by completely removing that source and that ability for them to continue laying eggs. And then, especially if you live in warmer weather and warmer areas of the United States, if there's new growth that continues to come up either in the fall or through the winter, continue to cut and remove that foliage so that in the spring you can let it grow up, and that in theory those the parasites aren't there and it's fresh, clean foliage ready for the monarchs to use. So probably better just to avoid it, but if you can't, I would say please make sure you kind of take precautions to keep your garden a nice, safe, healthy place for monarchs to use. So now that we've talked about milkweeds, which is our kind of the big ticket item for a Monarch Waystation, I want to talk about nectar sources, and that's all the food and the snacks that the monarch butterflies are going to be feeding on as they visit your waystation and as they're migrating either north and south in the course of their life. I think I mentioned before, you want to have a variety of sources, so they have lots of different things to choose from and to eat. Ideally, native perennials are always be best. I know we've used both natives and non-natives for our Monarchs on the Move exhibit, but if you have a choice to pick between one or the other and you can only have one plant or two plants, those two things should be native, not only for the monarchs, but also for our other pollinators that are out there. Natives are always going to serve our native pollinators the best. The other thing you want to do is to aim for blooms that last all season. Now, this can't always be done with a single type of perennial, so that's why it would be helpful to have either several different perennials with staggered bloom times, or to include things like annuals where they're going to have flowers and blooms the whole summer long. So now I just wanted to give sort of a list of some perennials and annuals that, at least for us in our gardens, again, mid-Atlantic, that really do well, that we see monarchs visiting. This is by no means an exclusive list. There's tons and tons of plants available. These are ones that do well for us, that we enjoy using in our gardens, and also are generally available in most garden centers. Even some big box stores you might find carrying some of these plants. So I tried to pick ones that I thought a lot of you would it'd be fairly easy for you guys to source. The first plant on the list there is the Agastache, the anise hyssop, which is actually the purple flower that you see in the background of the slide with a monarch on it. So you can see it works, attracts monarchs. This plant usually gets maybe 2 or 3 feet tall, usually has like purpley blue flowers, but there are some newer varieties that are a little bit shorter and comes in oranges and pinks. So there's some flexibility there. Verbena bonariensis, that's a beautiful flower with sort of long, thin stems with purple flowers on the end. It is a perennial for us here in sort of the DC, Virginia area. Those of you that are north of, say, maybe Maryland, that it will probably just be an annual for you. So perennial for some of us, annual for some of you. The next 2 plants, both are lobelias. Both of them are cardinal flowers. One is Lobelia cardinalis, which is just regular cardinal flower, and the other one is Lobelia syphilitica, which is blue cardinal flower. What's nice about these is that they also are plants that tolerate moist soils. So if you have a wet spot, use that swamp milkweed, use these lobelia, you've already off to a great start, even if you have soil that's maybe less than ideal. Another great one is penstemon. That one's nice, has a little bit earlier blooms to it. So if you have some of the early season monarchs coming through, you have some nice sources of early season nectar for them. The next one is Joe Pyeweed, which I learned is Eupatorium, but has since gone through a name change, and I'm probably going to mispronounce it because I have not said it enough. Eutrichium or Eutrichium, so sorry to anyone that is cringing if I butchered that. This is a nice plant. It blooms more late summer, early fall. It does usually get pretty tall, but there is a smaller variety that you can consider called Little Joe, which only gets 4 feet tall, so little is relative. But this is one that we definitely see a lot of pollinators on it, not just monarch butterflies. And it's a really good source of sort of that fall nectar. One thing I haven't excuse me, really mentioned is that sort of fall nectar tends to be one of the things that a lot of scientists and conservationists recommend having in your garden, because that's when they're migrating and they need the most sources of energy to help sustain their travels. We also have Pycnanthemum muticum, which is blunt mountain mint. So this one is just an amazing pollinator plant all around. We have it in many of our gardens around Smithsonian Gardens, and it is literally humming with just tons and tons of pollinators all over it. And it's pretty amazing to watch and pretty cool. I would definitely recommend having this one in your garden, even if you're just trying to attract pollinators in general. One word of warning, it is in the mint family, as the name suggests. So it does like to make itself at home in your garden. So it's easy to control it by pulling stems and that kind of thing and keeping it kind of contained to a spot. But if you don't have a lot of room and you're worried about it sort of taking over your garden, put it in a container, put it in a pot. It'll still serve its purpose, but you won't have to worry about it spreading places where you don't want it. Some additional perennials. The first one there is Vernonia. This is another fall blooming plant. It gets these beautiful purple flowers on it. One that we like to use is one called Iron Butterfly, which gets probably 1 to 2 feet tall and just has this kind of beautiful cloud of purple flowers over the top of the foliage. So that's a beautiful one to pair with some of our other plants and fall blooming things like Solidago, which I have here on the list, and asters and sedums and that kind of thing. Coneflowers, next on our list. I think that one's one that a lot of you are probably very familiar with. It's a very popular garden perennial. Comes in tons of different colors and heights, and you name it, it comes in that color, and it comes in that shape, size, whatever. It's a very versatile plant, and I think that one's a really easy one for probably many of you to find and to include in your gardens. Also have Liatris, which is actually the purple flower that's here on this slide. And this is another one. It has these beautiful purple spike flowers that are blooming about now. So you're going to get some of the monarchs that are starting to get in your garden this time of year, and have that as a nectar source for them. Bee balm is another very popular garden plant that some of you are probably familiar with. Again, comes in a lot of different sizes and heights and colors and that kind of thing. This one also could attract hummingbirds, so kind of a 2-for-1 there. This one is another plant that's in the mint family, so it can be a bit of a spreader in the garden. So just keep that in mind, or put it in the pot, depending on what your circumstances are. It is also susceptible to powdery mildew, which is kind of a bummer since it's such a good plant to have in the garden. But there are some breeders are working to sort of kind of breed resistance to powdery mildew. So some of the newer varieties and cultivars are a little bit less susceptible to powdery mildew. So I would say do some research online, see which ones sort of make the most sense, both with height and color that you like, and also sort of per the breeder's recommendation might be a little bit less susceptible to powdery mildew. Then we have our asters. So again, pretty common fall plants. I think a lot of you probably recognize a lot of those in fall gardens. A lot of times they come in like the purple flowers, but we can also get them in whites and pinks. And it's really great for those fall migrating monarchs. And last on the list that I have here is solidago, which is goldenrod. Lots of different options for solidago. There's some shorter ones, there's some taller ones. Just as an unrelated note, it's not the cause of your fall allergies. That's ragweed. So please don't think that if you include goldenrod in your garden that you will in turn suffer with horrible allergy symptoms. This should definitely be included in your garden, both for pollinators and for monarchs. And there are so many other perennials out there, so many. The list is endless. I had a hard time narrowing it down to just these 2 slides. So really don't let this limit you, but maybe it's a good starting point if you don't know where to start and don't know what to turn to as some good starter perennials. And then I also want to talk about annuals because, like I said, if you have a small space and you don't have a lot of room for perennials, you might need something to kind of provide that flower and nectar source really for the whole summer. And annuals really fit that bill pretty well. So lantana is like the really big one that we always, when we have it planted in our gardens here at Smithsonian Gardens, the monarchs just go crazy. They're like kids in a candy store, just all over it, flying around. It's really beautiful. So that one would definitely be top of my list as a plant to include either in a container or in a garden bed. I know that in some areas of like the Southeast United States, it is borderline invasive. So you might want to just be careful for those of you that maybe listening from like Florida, that kind of thing. You might want to err on the side of some of these other annuals and not lantana. But for those of us where lantana is not hardy over the winter months, definitely worth including in your garden. Zinnias, another great one. I would recommend that if you're familiar with zinnias, you know that many of them come in sort of like the bigger, like fluffy double zinnias. I would say try to restrict yourself to the ones that are just the single flower ones, the ones that just look like a daisy. It makes it a lot easier for the monarchs and other pollinators to get to the nectar source because they don't have to sort of like weed through all of the petals of a double flowering zinnia. Pentas, which is also called Egyptian starflower. It gets these sort of beautiful like flower clusters, comes in reds, pinks, whites, purples. It's a really hardy perennial, very drought tolerant, performs really well in the garden and in containers. Tithonia is one that we include very often in our pollinator garden over at Natural History. And that's a popular one that we love seeing the monarchs on because they have these beautiful bright orange flowers, and then seeing the monarch on top of it, it's awesome. I would say try to get the variety called Torch. Normally that plant, if you get the straight species, is about 6 or 7 feet tall, which I'm sure for many of you seems like a very tall plant to have in your garden. The Torch variety only gets probably about 4 or 5 feet tall. So if it's something that you like or have room to include, I would say seek out the one that's a little bit shorter. Sunflowers, just your traditional sunflowers that everybody knows and recognizes. Great for monarchs, great for pollinators. They will visit that. They will love it. That's a really easy one to find, and it's really easy to grow from seed. So that one is definitely an easy one if you can't get other annuals, at least get some sunflower seeds. Marigolds, that's a very popular classic annual for our gardens. Again, a great option for our monarchs. Salvias, lots of different salvias. Monarchs love them. And what's nice about salvias is that our hummingbirds love them too. So another plant, kind of 2 for 1 to attract both monarchs and hummingbirds. Gomphrena is one that I think is just really cute. It's such a cute flower. It's a little bit like verbena, if you're familiar with that. It gets these little ball-like flowers on the end of stems. And there's one in particular called Fireworks that gets actually enormous. And it has like these long stems with these bright pink flowers on the end, but it's perfect to plant in a perennial garden and just have all the stems kind of coming up through your perennials. And it's really cute and it just blooms like crazy all summer. Great addition, but there are some shorter ones. So if you don't have room for that, or if you just have a container, there are ones that fit in a container or the edge of a garden bed. And last, we just have herbs. So herbs, the flowers that are on herbs, such as basil and chives and mints and lavenders, they're very attractant to pollinators and including monarchs. And what's great about that is it's 2 for 1. They get to have the flowers and the nectar source, and you get to have all of the herbs to use in your kitchen for the summer months. I just wanted to give 2 kind of quick little combinations for those of you that are like, okay, those were a lot of plants that you just listed off really fast. Wanted to give you some combinations to sort of get your creative juices flowing, get you thinking in terms of like, what are some plants that you can pair together to create this Monarch Waystation instead of just looking at an enormous list of plants and feeling overwhelmed and not know where to start. So this first combination is designed to be put in a container. So you can put it on a balcony, you can put it on a patio, wherever you might have space to put something. I started with Asclepias, of course. Always want to start with that and always have that. I recommend the tuberosa for a container since it's a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to fit into a container. Then we have the yellow coneflowers, which is the Echinacea kismet yellow in this instance for this particular container combination. So there I'm including a native, a perennial. What's nice about coneflowers is that if you keep them deadheaded, sometimes they will sort of have some staggered blooms throughout the season. Of course, we have our lantana there. They're our wildly popular butterfly magnet. And then the pentas is the red cluster flowers there, which do really great in containers. They really thrive all summer long. And then I also included a coleus because I like designing annual containers. And for me, a good annual container also just for aesthetic reasons for yourself, because you're going to be looking at this container, is to have something that's a little bit of foliage, just to add some contrast and to add some visual interest. So admittedly, though coleus does sometimes get flowers, it's not really there for monarchs, but you want to have a container that you're going to enjoy, but also has the benefits for the monarchs. So I wanted to put that in there to kind of show a nice, well-rounded, designed, aesthetically pleasing container. And then this would be a combination for perhaps a garden space. So depending on how much space you have, these could be some starter plants just to get yourself going. Started with actually 2 different types of Asclepias in this instance. One of them is the swamp milkweed, and it's the Cinderella variety, which has really actually nice fragrant flowers. And then the Asclepias tuberosa and the variety Hello Yellow. So you can see compared to the last one, which it was just the traditional orange flower, this one has beautiful yellow flowers on it. Then you can include things like the Echinacea tiki torch, which has a really fun, bright orange flower to it. Actually, if any of you are familiar with Mount Cuba Center, they did Echinacea trials several years ago, and this was one of the best performing orange colored Echinacea they have. So that was kind of my reason for selecting this one, is that it's a good just garden performer. Then we also have some Agastache. Now this one is one of the ones that I mentioned that's more of like a pinky orange color. and it's the Acapulco salmon in pink. So tongue twister. So that's one that you might be able to find in a garden center. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit neater and tidier than some of the other agastaches that are the taller blue flowering ones. Now I do also have the pycnanthemum. So you could certainly put it in the garden if you wanted, or just put it in a pot, maybe near your garden so that it's available, it's nearby. But it's such a good all-around pollinator plant that I could not include it in this, even in this example. Also included an aster. This one's purple dome, which is a very common one that you'll find in garden centers. So it's easy to find, easy to locate, and has those beautiful bright purple flowers on it. And then for annuals, of course, lantana, as always, and as well as the zinnia, profusion cherry. And there you can see what I mean by using a zinnia that has like a daisy-like flower instead of some of the more like fluffy domed ones. So that really concludes my presentation. I hope some of you feel inspired to go out and at least do one thing to help monarchs, and hopefully that one thing isn't planting Asclepias. Excuse me. And I think at this time we're gonna take questions, try to run through some of them. I do have some of the sources here, but I believe some of the sources we've been sharing in the chat box and will also be on our website. Along with the plant lists, all the plants that I just listed in my presentation. If you didn't get them written down, that's okay. They're gonna be on the website. So don't worry if you missed anything. Yeah.
Thank you, Sarah. I was going to say the same thing. We've gotten asked a lot of questions. I was able to answer some of them, but I was saving the Monarch directed questions for Sarah, but there were a lot of questions.
Oh boy.
I won't be able to relate all of them to you right now, but we will post them on our website. We are creating a series of resource pages that follow all of our Let's Talk Garden webinars. And we found that that's much easier because Sarah's a horticulturist, I'm a horticulturist and educator, but we do have entomologists, arborists, and other experts on our staff that we ask questions to make sure that we're giving you the best possible answers. So I think some of them that kept coming up, and this is something that us in the suburbs and urban areas, well, not so much urban areas, but country areas, we have deer problems, and they love to eat everything. And I think that's what the main message. I'm not even going to ask you what's deer proof because I already know the answer. Nothing is deer proof.
Right.
If exactly. A deer is hungry, he is going or she's going to eat whatever is in its path. So realize that even herbs, things that have sour flavors, a young deer is going to nosh on it for a while until they learn that they don't like that flavor. So really the best thing to do if you have a deer problem is before you plant a garden, and I stress before you plant a garden, put a fence up or plant as close to your house, because the deer are going to munch on many of these because they are a lot of natives that Sarah recommended. So I wanted to get that out of the way. Nothing is really deer proof. It just sometimes they like different flavors better than others. So one of them I thought, and I've been asked this quite a bit too, do you believe in harvesting some of the caterpillars and raising them inside so that they have a better chance of escaping any type of predator and then releasing them afterwards? What do you feel about that?
I think certainly it's a sort of a fun project, especially if you have kids or if you're in a school setting, to really talk about sort of the life lessons of what the biology of a butterfly in general might be. I think to some extent, it's a little bit the circle of life, which you kind of hate to admit to ourselves, is that caterpillars from moths and butterflies are a food source for birds. So if you're someone that's very passionate about saving them and making sure that that one butterfly makes it out in the world, I think there's probably nothing wrong with bringing it inside and trying to rear it inside. But I also think that whether we like it or not, that it is a part of life and it is in part of our environment, and that not all of them are going to make it. And it's just sort of the general realization. And unfortunately, even once they turn into butterflies, the risk does not go down just because they're not a caterpillar anymore. There is still a risk of them being eaten even in their butterfly stage of life by birds. And a lot of them I've seen actually just are a result of just like cars on the road, like hitting them as you're driving. So unfortunately, even if you go to all the effort of raising it inside, once you release it, I mean, there's really not a lot of guarantee that it'll even make it out once you release it, which seems like a very Debbie Downer thing to say.
No,
but
it's an
unfortunately, it is sort of the reality. But I think it's a situation where you have certainly kids or a classroom setting or something like that, or you have like a science learning lab, that it's at least a very fun thing to do. And it's fun to sort of watch them progress through their life cycle that way.
And one thing I would highly recommend, if you are going to do this, make sure you have a steady supply of milkweed to feed those hungry caterpillars.
They eat a lot.
Because if you call a botanic garden to ask them to share their milkweed with you, they're going to say no. So please, if you're going to raise them inside, make sure you have enough milkweed to be able to get it through its total cycle to be able to release the butterfly vento.
They can eat a lot of milkweed.
Yeah, this one was a great question. Have you noticed a decreased amount of butterflies, insects, honeybees, regular bees in the garden this year?
That is a great question. I mean, this year's a little bit, well, certainly this year it's a little difficult to say because we all have not been outside in our gardens as much.
Yes. More so.
Yeah, right. I think that's a really difficult question to answer because I'm not sure that I've been in the Mid-Atlantic region or even probably consciously aware of it and paying attention to it for as long as I maybe should have been, since I'm probably newer into my career than some people. So just my general observations of garden life don't extend that many years. So I think it's hard for me to say if I feel like I noticed a decrease or not.
I've been outside so much this year, and I'm way older than you. So I have way more under my belt. I've seen more. I've seen more bumbles, more native bees, more butterflies, more birds than I've ever seen before. But that could be because I'm outside of my own garden more than I have ever been before. So it's hard to say. And different areas are going to have different numbers to go along. So now if you really want to plant one of these gardens, how many plants do you need? And I'm hoping your answer is something that we can all do.
Right. Well, I was hoping that in general this presentation no one would feel limited to, oh my goodness, I have to have 20 plants or whatever, because certainly a container, if that's all you have room for is one container in your balcony, you're only going to have 4 or 5 plants. Like, let's be honest. I think if you're in a garden setting and you have a little bit more room to play with, I'll actually reference the Monarch Watch organization. They actually have a program where you can get your garden certified as a certified Monarch Waystation, which is something that we did for our Monarchs on the Move exhibit.
How do you do that? How do you certify? You just go to their website?
Yes. So they go to their website and they have, they explain it. There's basically a checklist where you just have to self-evaluate if you meet all the criteria on sort of their predetermined checklist of what they think really suits the needs of monarchs. And so at least size-wise, they say about 100 square feet is really the minimum that you want to have to be, certainly to be certified based on their criteria and just sort of have the appropriate number of plants. If you have about 100 square feet, you're looking at 50 to 75 plants, probably.
That's not going to fit on my deck.
Right, exactly. Right. So I feel like I didn't want to go into that too much because I don't want any of you watching to feel discouraged. Like, I don't have 100 square feet. I don't want to buy 50 plants. Like, I realize that's not realistic for many people, but also realize that if you already have a garden, there's a good chance you already have some of those plants and you already have things available for them to use. And it may just be a matter of including the milkweed. I would say include more than 1 plant of milkweed if you have room, unless you're in a container. I would say at least 3 to 5 milkweed plants. And if you have room, if you can have more than 1 kind, that would also be beneficial. So that's probably the most concrete number I'm willing to put out there.
And I think that we should invite our neighbors to plant. If we live on balconies and patios, Invite your neighbors. This is
Absolutely.
a good social distancing topic to shout across the fence and encourage them to buy some to share with the butterflies that you're attracting with your plants.
Right.
So this one, it is almost, oh, we do have 5 more minutes. I'm looking at it. So let me check to see. I have seen this too. This is the first year I have seen yellow milkweed. So the regular butterfly weed that you usually just see in orange, I've seen yellow. Can you tell us about the new color saturation?
So that is, I guess, I don't know how new it is. I don't know how long it's been available on the market, but that one is the variety called Hello Yellow, which I think I showed in sort of my last slide for a garden combination. So it's basically something where I don't know the full history of it and how it came to be, but a breeder or someone somewhere maybe saw basically a mutation of a regular orange butterfly weed that maybe had some yellow in it and kind of kept playing with that and kept breeding it until they got to the yellow flower. As far as I know, it still has all the same properties of a regular Asclepias as far as the needs that the monarchs have for sequestering those chemicals. It just happens to have a yellow colored flower. So I have not heard anything about it being different or not as good as straight species. But what's nice about it is it does give us as gardeners a little bit of flexibility in designing in the aesthetics of our garden. So it's kind of nice to have that option just for us.
That's true. Yeah. And that brings to the question, I was asked, what colors do the monarchs prefer? So it looks like they like yellow and orange.
They do, yeah. So I think largely they like kind of hot colors, like the reds, the oranges, and yellows. But then you saw in my picture with one of the anisisop plants, that was a blue flower. And also a lot of salvias come in blue and kind of purpley colored flowers. And I would say they're just as attracted to them. So I'm not sure that there's any color that they're not attracted to per se. Greens and blues, I think if you look online, I think greens and blues generally are the ones that they can see less well. And they can see sort of the oranges and reds and yellows a little bit better. But if there's a nectar source there, and they will find it. So yeah.
Yeah, that's been my experience as well.
Yeah.
And we're getting lots and lots of questions about, is it safe to use pesticides? Is it safe to use neem oil? Is it safe to use insecticidal soap? And I think we both should stress that a pesticide is created to kill insects, and so most of them are not, they don't distinguish between the insects that you want to keep and the insects that you don't want to keep. And the organic is still, just because it's derived from an organic material does not mean that it's not a deadly product. So be very careful. I don't know what you're doing in the garden, but at home I don't spray anything. So how about you?
Certainly for our exhibit with Smithsonian Gardens, I mean, maybe I've just been lucky and haven't needed to use anything. I don't do anything at home. A lot of times, especially if you have and I know this may not be for everybody, but if you have a small garden, what's nice about that is if you notice pest problems, though it may be gross and maybe a little time consuming, sort of physically removing the pest insect from your plant oftentimes is the most effective and the safest way to remove them. So squishing them, or if you have things like aphids, if you just get out your hose and put it on the jet setting and just plant might look a little battered, but it'll blow all the aphids off. And I think certainly things like neem oil or insecticidal soaps, or I mean, I really even hesitate to say this, maybe you could say that they're a little bit safer, but you just really want to be super careful because you don't know, even something with like a neem oil, if there's an egg, a monarch egg on the underside of a leaf, a milkweed leaf, and you spray that neem oil, it's very likely, that's a product that really works by kind of smothering an insect. So if you smother that egg, even though it's a safe product and it's organic, you probably just killed that egg.
Yes.
And same with insecticidal soaps, kind of the same thing. So I think the best thing is just to be vigilant and just as much as you can, do it by hand. And, or if you have something and you really feel like you need to use some kind of product to get a pest population under control, do it very carefully, spot spray as carefully as you possibly can, and try to look to make sure that there aren't any beneficials already on there. Because there even could be, if it's something like aphids, there could already be ladybird beetles on there. And you don't want to hurt the ladybird beetles, which are literally there to help control the aphid population. So you just want to really take your time, inspect the plant closely, do it by hand if you can, and just really, yeah, be careful.
Thank you. Be careful out there is a
Be
good
careful out there,
message.
yeah.
Be careful
Yeah.
out there. But thank you, Sarah. This has been delightful. I've really enjoyed hearing your presentation and asking some questions. We didn't get to all of them, but as I said before, we will post questions and answers to our website as soon as possible. It takes us a little bit of time to be able to get things up on website. But it has been a delight. And thank you for teaching us all about butterflies from your experience and all about the plants that you would include in your garden. We'll see you all next week, we hope. Next week, we'll be talking about exuberant containers. So thank you for joining us today. See you soon. Be safe out there, right? Bye.